3, 2, 1. Hello, and welcome back to the On Global Leadership Workshop on doing business in today's China. In this session, we are going to be talking about China's consumer ecosystem. Hopefully you're seeing, and it's becoming clear that each of these sessions build on each other. In the last session, session 4, we talked about China's innovation economy, and before that, we talked about the manufacturing economy. And so each of these topics flow together, and so there's a lot of overlap in some parts of it. But today we're going to be very much focusing on the consumer ecosystem and what that means for companies who want to do business in China. The key takeaways from session 5. 1, as one of the world's most populous nations, China is one of the world's largest consumer markets. 2, here again, as with the manufacturing supply chain and the evolution of innovation, China's consumer ecosystem has undergone profound changes over the course of the last 4 decades, the period of economic reform. 3, local governments, the private sector, foreign partners, and information technologies have all contributed to the radical transformation. 4, businesses seeking to take advantage of this evolving consumer ecosystem must gain an understanding for the complex dynamics between government guidance, innovation, and consumers. Now, very quickly, as always, just to emphasize the points, history matters, culture matters. Now, in the case of China, that history is long and the culture is very complex, but it's very important to walk in with an appreciation for how to get a deep understanding of this, or at least as deep as you can. China is a political entity, a large nation, the world's most populous or second most populous nation now, headquartered in Beijing, but it's also a very complex system. It's a complex system of 31 provincial level units, many municipalities, many townships, many villages. That particular political nuance is something that we've emphasized in terms of thinking about this dance between the central government and the ways in which local governments as industrial firms, as we often say, seek to deliver on the KPIs that are set by the headquarters. Today, it's going to get even more complex because we need to think about not just the municipalities and townships and villages, but also the different consumer sectors that are emerging. We've talked a lot about the innovation in China, but also the manufacturing supply chain. And it's also important to think about China's growing and changing role in the geopolitical economy. Our philosophy, as always, is to emphasize the importance of culture and history, to emphasize China's political economy and the complexities therein, particularly over the last 40 years, but also to emphasize real-world experiences and real-world examples. This is both examples that come from the work we do in writing about, and advising companies, but it also is sort of based on an ethnographic approach to understanding China. And what I mean by that is, if you think about the social sciences, one end of the spectrum, demographers and statisticians think a lot about macro level data, and they just gather data. And if you have micro level data, it's all data gathered as part of survey research or as part of just the data on behaviors in large numbers. Ethnographic research is much more of what we like to think of as the boots on the ground experience. Ethnographers typically are anthropologists and sometimes sociologists, and they like to get out there and talk to people. And so in this particular session, we're going to spend a little bit of time watching some video that comes from our being out there in the field interviewing people. And so it's just a way to give you a little more flavor of what it means to think about the complexities of this consumer ecosystem. So this is session 5, China's consumer ecosystem. Let's dive in. Okay. So I want to start off with this ethnographic approach to things. So when I was working at Apple, executives China was a puzzle to them. So we understood the manufacturing supply chain really well. And we understood how to deal with the partnerships in the supply chain and how to leverage those relationships to get low costs, and all of that stuff was working really well. And Apple in terms of the consumer market, China was Apple's second largest consumer market, second to the US, but it was heavily concentrated in tier 1 and tier 2 cities. And I often had executives in the marketing world come to me and say, how come we're not hitting tier 3, 4, and 5 cities? We are almost non-existent in tier 3, 4, and 5 cities. And my sense was, you don't understand tier 3, 4, and 5 cities. You might be Apple and you might be huge and you might have all kinds of marketing and research budgets, but you got to get out there in the field. And so this particular video came from just me taking a research team out into the field and just doing the kind of interviews that we believe, again, we're talking about these as sort of ethnographic interviews that are, if you want to have a deep understanding of a consumer market, whether it's in China or anywhere in the world, but specifically we're talking about China today and doing business in China, you got to get out there in the field and you got to talk to people. So let's take a couple minutes as you're watching this. Imagine that we were in class together and we were going to stop the video at the end and you would tell me what you saw, but take some notes and just think about your observations as we go through this. So this is Shehong County in Sichuan Province, a tier 5 city.
一天变2个，看图是没得跳，这个跟哪个还找哪个还找师傅嘛？这个，我就是原来杀猪卖肉，我都没得师傅。你记什么？这个要说人勤快，想搞点钱呢，当然这个就喜欢做。
吴大爷，他就是从开始卖被斗，他开始卖跟别个哈，别个那些他销售量不这样的好，所以他长期他就一直教我，他觉得我们这些人对，我一直自己做生意，我是从96年开始做的，你看大概就是22年了，已经都。现在的经营状况哈，比原来我们那个时候做的经营状况好得多，因为我们那个时候文化有限，不懂，网上就卖不来，都是靠自己的整办。这会卖呀，只能说把一家人生活靠就走。
美国钱。
娃儿跟他媳妇那个原来就开始淘宝高头卖了3年多4年了，在淘宝上卖的呀，当然说就比我们现在这个门面上销售量大到哪去？
这个网上数据看的话，就是订单稍微比较多的就是上海、北京、河北这一带，因为现在竹制品，现在好多城市都提倡绿色环保，所以说好多现在越来越更多人喜欢竹制品了，纯天然的。我就打个比方，就是我们现在用的这种竹制婴儿车。它是整体是用竹子做的婴儿车，因为他们这种有种儿时啊，这种小时候那种感觉。 我觉得中国人现在是基本上大部分，就是很大部分人现在的收入啊，各方面都比以前好多了。所以说，中国人价值观对未来肯定还是很向往的。
Okay, I mean, those two sentences at the end are the most important. I mean, just think about this. I mean, first of all, again, remember, one of the important things about this kind of exercise is getting away from the macro level data and going out into the field and talking to people, seeing what they're able to tell you, seeing how it feels, right? And then taking these kinds of ideas back to your boardroom or to your marketing team or to your supply chain and infrastructure team and thinking this is what this looks like, right? But those two sentences at the end, Taobao, allowing this family of basket makers to take their product from 1 million to 3 million RMB in over a couple of year period. And this is just one family of 400 million that operate in this space, right? So these are big numbers, big ideas, and it's important. But again, the most important thing for us is if you want to understand consumer ecosystems, there's the big numbers, but there's also the feeling that you get when you talk to people. And we all believe that that's important. Now, let me say something about, so Taobao kind of brings us into the mobile payments aspect. And we're going to talk more about this in the next session where we talk about the relationship between technology and society. But I just want to give one sense of just the differences in magnitude here. And these data are a little bit dated, but in the last couple of years, the data we tracked down showed that the mobile payments in the United States, so in other words, money that changed hands over phones or over computers, but more often phones, about $50 billion, okay, USD. In China, the number is 12.8 trillion. Think about what that means. Think about 12.8 trillion. Now, you may be saying to yourself, how is that possible? That's as large as the Chinese economy, and it's about 250 times the amount of money that changes hands in mobile payments in the United States. Yes, and yes. Now, the reason that's important in terms of that being about the size of the Chinese economy is what that means is that it's not just that all of the economy is happening in mobile payments. It's not what the case is, but it means that many transactions are happening on mobile payments. So, for example, if you have a family, or let's say a couple of families that go to a restaurant together, and they sit down and they eat, and then they pay the wait staff in mobile payments, but then they decide they want to split the bill, and then half of the money flows from one family to the other family. All of those get counted in mobile payments. So you're over counting or double counting some of the money. So it's not really the size of the Chinese economy. But the important thing to note is in China, the number is about 250 times that in the United States in terms of what's happening on mobile payments. Okay, so it's a big number and it's a big important thing. And so if you look at this family out in Shehong County in Sichuan province, and how are these basket makers making 3 million RMB a year? It's because of Taobao and mobile payments. Okay, so it just gives you a sense. Now, for those who have visited China, this type of scene won't be surprising, but I remember being surprised about it in the early days of mobile, where you have beggars on the street who they have QR codes. And so, you know, forget about the cup to put the RMB in, just, you know, get out your phone and give us some money on our QR code. But so again, it's, you know, we're talking about it running the gamut of what people do. Now, to give some sort of background or infrastructure to this conversation, right? So remember, we talked about this notion that you have government guidance from above, and that's both Beijing, but also the local governments and municipalities and townships, the provinces, municipalities and townships. But China's consumer ecosystem, again, this is 1.4 billion people. There's a lot of people that are hungry the hungry for producing things, hungry for services, like the Mobike example in the previous session. So you have this, what we like to think of as populist creativity from below, an entrepreneurial population looking for solutions, access, opportunity. And in some ways, there's a long history of this conversation because it's characterized by what's called the Guanxi or the network society, and individual ingenuity. So if you sort of think about this network structure that's much more culturally embedded in China than it is, say, in the United States. If you thought about the United States as what's a core aspect of the United States culture, you might say an atomistic society, individualism, the notion of Adam Smith's marketplace. In China, one of the core features of the culture is the Guanxi network, right? 你跟他有关系吗？人与人之间的关系, right? And so that type of infrastructure sort of works very well for thinking about this notion of populist creativity from below. So you have government guidance from above, 1.4 billion people that are embedded in these networks. But how's that all going to fit together? And so you need a private sector. You need private facilitation. Previously, this was the local state sector, but currently the private sector rapidly moving up the value chain from imitation to innovation, redefining their own standards of innovation. So let's talk about how this actually works, right? So you have the central government and you have local state governments and you have all of these small scale entrepreneurs, populist creativity. There's this character here is Geti, which stands for Getihu, which is something that I'm going to talk about in a minute, but it means household enterprise or household business. So you have all of these players down at the bottom, and then you have the central government sort of setting the plan, local state governments facilitating the plan. But how does the system all work together? How do you get from there to there, right? Well, you have an entire system that has evolved over the course of the last 40 years, but really the last 20 years. So you have central control and central mandates, but also centralized incentives. And then you have the private sector, which works very closely with the central government. Companies like Alibaba and Tencent, which emerged in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And they play key roles here. But those companies, even by themselves, are probably too big still to really think about alone. And so you have intermediary players, companies like JD.com and Meituan and Ele.com and Taobao, right? And then you have all of these sub-brands, which are connected to these intermediary brands. And you have the small scale basket makers sort of pushing up these brands to the larger players. And then this getting, so for example, in the case of the basket maker in Sehong County, you have a Getihu that is pushing its product up to the sub-brand and then up to Taobao. And then it's spreading throughout China, right? So this is just our idea of how to conceptualize the system. And of course, there are big players there, right? Tencent and Alibaba, the Huawei's of the world, big players in the private sector. But it's also crucial to think about that China is, you remember what Li Keqiang said at Davos in 2015. China is not just the state-owned system with centralized control or large-scale private companies. China is a place of, he said 1.3 billion people, but probably 1.4 billion people is accurate, with hundreds of millions of micro entrepreneurs that play roles here. So you have what are called the Getihu. Getihu often evolve into what are called Xingqie, so they're still private, but the real small scale players are the Getihu, the household enterprises, and the Xiaowei the small scale enterprises, right? And these play a tremendous role in building out this consumer ecosystem. Like, how do you get from big products and big companies to the 1.4 billion people? You do it through the small scale entrepreneurs, the household businesses and the small businesses, Getihu and Xiaowei. I love this story. On December 11th, 1980, Miss Zhang received the first Getihu license in China. So again, think about this, right? So Deng Xiaoping comes to power, in February of 1979, sets in place a new motion. It used to be, I mean, private businesses were targeted during the Cultural Revolution, and even before that, in the early era of following the Communist Revolution. Today, in 1980, they were welcomed into the system. Deng Xiaoping saw that we needed innovation. And so Ms. Zhang received the first Getihu license in China. And through this license, she started her business with 150 renminbi. From selling buttons in a small shop, she's now the exclusive distributor for Weixin Group in Wenzhou. And the Weixin Group is the first company to be publicly traded in the field of manufacturing buttons and zippers in China. All right, so it's just, you know, just like with Zhou Chunfei and Grace Wang, I love the case of this woman. Unfortunately, I've never had the opportunity to interview her directly, but Ms. Zhang is famous in the Getihu literature and space. Now, if you think about this, so Getihu, small scale entrepreneurs are allowed into the market in 1980. And then over the course of the next 30 plus years, you see the emergence of different responses to the growth of this market. You see early entrepreneurship happening. You see the growth of the non-state economy. You see the new Getihu occurring in about 2008, 2009. You see the Xiaowei reforms, okay? And so it's just been an ongoing step-by-step process. Remember, we talked about the Deng Xiaoping's phrase, 摸石过河, feeling for stones to cross the river, right? If we want a very, very innovative capitalist class, we have to figure out step by step how to get there. You don't just command it and it occurs. Now, here's something that I just like to point out to listeners. So look at the US population, right? Over 300 million people, okay? Full-time employment in the United States total is under 150 million, so under half of the population. If you look at the Getihu alone, the household businesses, and to be a Getihu, you have to be less than 9 people, so 8 people or less, right? So you can have 1 leader and then 7 employees, but if you grow bigger than that, you become a Siyingqie, so you're no longer a Getihu. But in those small-scale household enterprises, you have more people employed than all of the people employed in the United States. Now, if you put together the Getihu and the Xiaowei, you have almost as many people employed as the entire US population, right? And so that's kind of incredible. And again, this is a powerful micro labor force. And this doesn't even count all of the large scale enterprises that are publicly traded and the state-owned enterprises. This is just the small scale enterprises that have emerged in the economic reform era. Now let's, again, talking about the consumer ecosystem, let's shift gears and talk a little bit about who are we talking about, right? And again, this is, we're gonna do a little ethnography. We're gonna just talk to some people that our group has talked to over the years. But, you know, what does it mean to be a millennial in China today, right? So these are citizens that are born between 1982 and 1998. And the numbers, again, are big, right? So in both, it's about the same percentage of the population in the United States and China, but because China is about 4 times the size of the United States in population, you have about 400 million millennials that you need to be thinking about as consumers and understanding what that consumer market means compared to about 90 million in the United States, right? And so just thinking through and understanding what that means and how to touch those individuals is important, right? So let's do another ethnography and just go a little deep. Chengdu, the capital of Sichuan province, tier 1 city. This is getting us into the micro level through the voices of a couple of kids.
大家就朋友不一定有共同的兴趣，然后有共同的兴趣的人也不一定会成为朋友。但是音乐却让我做到了这一点，就是跟我有一样的音乐兴趣的人都成为了我的朋友。所以说，我觉得音乐非常重要，对我来说。我们乐队基本上是每天都有在排练，然后除非一些特殊情况，可能会暂停1-2天，或者是在演出之后的一天，我们会休息一下。我们乐队现在有4个成员，除了我以外，有37，他是我们的节奏吉他手；有关，他是我们的主音吉他手；还有燕，他是负责架子鼓。我今年18岁，才从
我今年18岁，
我今年18岁，
我今年18岁。
我明年会在美国读大1，在未来的话，我想做一个工程师，就像材料工程或者是航空航天之类的。然后
我明年在成都上大学。我明年的计划是录制一些自己的歌曲，然后去中国的其他地方去演出。
我将会去到中国音乐学院，专业是作曲与作曲技术理论。
就租一个地下室，做一个自己的排练室。乐队来说的话，因为我们明年贝斯会出国，有一个吉他手会去北京读书，然后我们会和新的乐手磨合，希望把乐队做得更成熟一些。
我最喜欢的是 Creator，就是一支来自德国的激流金属乐队。
枪花、涅槃、绿洲，就他们3个乐队代表了大致一个年代里边不同的摇滚的类型。
涅槃主唱卡特·科本，对我来说一直是个偶像吧。
我最喜欢的是 Oasis， 因为他们具有一种摇滚的态度，以及对世界的思考，然后一种大爱精神吧。
我希望在未来我们可以有更多的青少年能参与的一些创新的活动，然后有更自由的空间，让我们发挥我们自己的长处。
那这个课是哪里的？对内，我希望，国内就是中国在国家内部可以有更小的贫富差距。
我认为中国的未来应该更多注重在精神和文化层次上，而不简单的停留在物质层面的富足上。
我希望中国可以信息更开放一些，因为中国现在没有 Facebook， 然后互联网相对封闭，然后还是希望中国越变越好吧，毕竟是我的，但也要面对更多的问题，希望知识分子多一些吧，渔民少一些。
对，我会，就是如果离开家，然后去那么远的地方读书，真的会很伤心。就算我们有，就像什么 WeChat 呀，或者是就是那种可以交流的软件，但是真正的那种情感上面的联系，我觉得可能还是会稍微减少。
就你在学校的时候，你很难找到一个和你有共同想法的人，所以说当我们找到一个合适的人选择的时候，就是情感根深蒂固的时候，我们会更加珍惜这个，而不是单纯的是因为我们是独生子女才会有这种。
It's a how many times must you getting both back before you can find everything. It's nothing, it's blowing in the wind. Yes, it's blowing in the wind.
That's a wrap.
So here again, if you're wondering why are we watching films of kids in a band, the important thing for understanding consumer ecosystems isn't just about the big data. and how many people are using what. It's about getting a rich, deep understanding, just like we're asking you to get a rich, deep understanding for history and culture. We want you to appreciate what it takes to get a rich, deep understanding of how people think and how people feel. And so you have the family of basket makers in Sohong, and in the city of Chengdu, you have these high school students who are listening to Blowing in the Wind. But also talking about what it is that concerns them and what their thoughts are. And this is really what the consumer ecosystem is about. It's about the balance of what the potential market is and what the actual individual thinking is about what the consumers want, and then how to bridge that gap. And so that's what we're trying to emphasize here. It's not just about millennials, though. It's also about senior citizens. Again, sorry for these statistics are a little bit dated. But in the United States, you have about 20% of the population, or 70 million people, that are above the age of 60. In China, it's about 16%, but still, again, it's more than 3 times as many people as in the United States population. So the numbers are big. And predicting out to what it's going to look like in 2050, we're probably going to have, aging populations in both cases. So we're going to have about 100 million people in the United States, or about 30% of the population, being above the age of 60. And in China, we're probably going to see about 30%, with the improvement of healthcare services, and about 437 million people that are above the age of 60. So these are big markets, right? And so understanding how to reach that consumer ecosystem, but not just what the numbers are, what does that group think like, and how do they feel, is what's important. Now, to talk about the consumer ecosystem, we also need to think about retail, right? And how does it work in China, right? So this isn't just about how does the basket maker through Taobao get his baskets sold throughout China, or what are the kids who are millennials in Chengdu feeling, but it's also about a retail infrastructure. And so what does that look like? Let's start with one more ethnographic video. I promise this will be our last video, but again, these videos are set up to give you a sense of how do people talk about these things. And so this is a case of a young entrepreneur who's talking about how she built her business, which has now become quite a successful business in China.
他们的时间是已经 confirm 的11点到12点嘛，我那边是 OK 的。昨天 Joanna 问过我一次，不是因为昨天说的是 phone interview，所以最后定的是见面。Most of the entrepreneurs in China from last generation or like 10 years ago, they are male. My partner is also a girl, and we start to do fundraising, and we met with so many investors. And lots of feedbacks we got were always like, oh, you're girls and you will get emotional, you will fight with each other, the company will go down. And that was super helpful for us, because my partner and I were like, okay, we're gonna make it, because like they don't believe in us.
Such an impressive interview.
When we just started this brand, we're thinking, okay, for people like us who want brands like Asian fitting activewear, where are they? Lululemon, Nike, and Adidas, Western brand or like mega brands, they make their own products and they don't really fit Asians. So we were thinking, why don't we start something to do activewear, but only for Asians? And that's why we started Maya. When we say Asian fitting, we're not just talking about fitting experience. We're also talking about design, colors, and everything. So first of all, we use the Asian body type data as our magnet, and then we do the fitting there. But when we do the adjusting for other sizes, we still look at the data pool for Asians. So for example, if you're cutting from small to medium, for Caucasians, it's actually going to be like 3 centimeters. But for Asians, it's probably only like 2.5. This type of difference is actually make a product fit you like perfectly. We have the confidence we can do a brand only for Asians. I wouldn't really imagine in my mom or dad's generation, they will have that type of confidence, because even nowadays, every time that I shop with my mom, like in Paris or in other like Western countries, I told her, okay, this clothing is really pretty, but it doesn't really fit you. But she still wants to go buy the Western brands because she thinks it's better. She still thinks that way. And I don't think I will ever like change her. She still thinks like Western brands are the best and then Asian brands can't really compete over it. But for my generation and for people like me who actually got the luxury to study abroad at early age and get a really good education, we actually have the capability to make something really good with great quality, with great image, and then do the business right. We talk about all these things. We talk about what are consumers really buying in terms of clothing. Is it attitude? Is it really a design? Is it really about the service or the experience? Is the China market so hard for foreigners to figure out? Actually, yes. So this is the thing. I think the Chinese consumer respond to the brand better because we know the market better. And we know the market better because we're local. I guess that's the real logic.
Amazing. So interesting to spend time with her. So impressive. And again, the emphasis here is it's fine to gather data and to look at the big data and look at the numbers. You have to get out there and talk to people. And I love the case of Jian because, you know, she emphasizes this issue of how well she understands the market because she's Chinese. And so, you know, but again, this gives you a sense of how the consumer ecosystem works. It works in terms of the raw numbers, but it also works in terms of a deep understanding of the basket maker and the millennials in Chengdu and John Wang in Shanghai. And so understanding the consumer ecosystem requires all of that to approach it. Famous brands, of course. When I was at Apple, we spent a lot of time thinking about what our flagship stores would look like. And when I arrived there for Apple in China, we had 6 stores in China. When I left, there were 53. And these places were really built to be anchors of the community. And you could just see it with the anticipation that people would have and the ways in which people were treated when they walked in the store. Our group has recently done some work on decathlon and the ways in which it's really customized for the Chinese consumer. And there's a lot of good stuff here that we've written about. And I'll let the China experts talk about this because they're so much closer to the experience and the data. And so, but it's really a remarkable case of a foreign company coming in and adapting to the local market and really kind of meeting Chinese consumers where they are. Now, remember, again, this is a story of the evolution of understanding the market, but it's also a story of the evolution of the consumer ecosystem and just the economy, right? So we talked about this in the early stages of our discussions, but just that transformation from 1994 to 2018, it's just a radical transformation from, you know, the area east of the Huangpu River where there was nothing except the Shanghai TV Tower to 20 years later, this being the site of 3 of the top 20 tallest buildings in the world, all within a block of each other. It's an incredible story about the consumer ecosystem and how to frame it. The reason I emphasize cities here is just to, again, think about it's important to understand the consumer ecosystem, not just because you have to get out into Shehong County to really understand what this little family of basket makers are doing, but it's also just to really understand the infrastructure and the scale. So 25 largest cities in the United States, this is about 124 million people. Right, the 25 largest cities in China. This is again about more than twice as many people populated in those areas. But it's important to note that the focus only, a lot of foreign companies make the mistake of focusing primarily and first and foremost on the largest cities. And China is an intricate system of what we call tiered cities, right? Tier 1, which are places like Shanghai, Beijing, Chongqing. Then there are tier 2 cities, tier 3 cities, tier 4 cities, tier 5 cities. You'll remember from the first video we showed you, Shehong County is a tier 5 city, right? And so it's important to understand this because, you know, again, the reason some of these videos were made is Apple marketing people came to me and said, we just don't understand. We understand tier 1 and tier 2 cities, and we're doing quite well, but we just don't seem to understand the consumer ecosystem down in 3, 4, and 5. But it's important to remember that's how China's structured, and there's, you know, different demographics for each of these places. Average city size of a tier 5 city is 50,000 people. These are places like Yan'an, Rizhao, Baoji. The average city size of a tier 1 city is about 9 to 10 million people. And these are places like Shanghai, Beijing, and Shenzhen, right? And so just understanding these are very, very different consumer ecosystems. So thinking of China as a consumer ecosystem as a whole is probably a little bit too simplistic. You have to break it down. And you see different behaviors in these places, right? In a tier 1 city, you're going to find places like an Apple store, and you'll see 3-generation households, the mother, a son, a granddaughter. And they'll, you know, you see these kinds of things fairly commonly. But then you see people in tier 3 cities that don't have access to the same kinds of retail spaces, but are still wanting to use the same kind of products and be connected. And, you know, you see people much further away in places like Anhui province. Okay. And so again, what we're trying to give you here is just this both the breadth of knowledge and the ways in which that consumer ecosystem is stretched across the country in these 1.4 billion people. And these are very different places, right? Shanghai, and if you've been to Shanghai, you've experienced what it's like to be in this just amazing urban megalopolis. And if you've been in Shehong County, you'll have a sense of just how different that is as a place. And so the consumer ecosystems of these two places are different. And our core thesis is to get out there and meet people, right? And that might seem like hard work and too time consuming, but that's what good marketing does. It understands consumer ecosystems through merging big data and ethnography. And that's what we're emphasizing here. So once again, the key takeaways for session 5 is one of the world's most populous nations. China is one of the world's largest consumer markets. Here again, as with the manufacturing supply chain and the evolution of innovation, China's consumer ecosystem has undergone profound changes over the course of the last 4 decades. Local governments, the private sector, foreign partners, and the information technology have all contributed to this radical transformation. Businesses seeking to take advantage of this evolving consumer ecosystem must gain insight, gain an understanding of the complex dynamics between government guidance, innovation, and consumers. And hopefully what you take away from this piece is, yes, it's important to get the big data and understand the system, but get out there and talk to people, talk to consumers. Understanding what the basket maker in Shehong is doing, or what the millennials in Chengdu are doing, or what Maya Active is understanding about their consumers in places like Shanghai are doing. This is where you're actually going to figure things out. And of course, you may say, well, but we need to understand, are these very specific circumstances or are they generalizable? And that's the hard part of really good social science research, is balancing the going deep ethnographic approach to learning versus with the making sure it's representative of the whole. And, you know, that's just a process, but we believe that getting out there and talking to people and then mapping that onto the larger consumer ecosystem in terms of numbers, but also to this system that's been built, which balances the central government, the local governments, and all the way down to the Gutihu with all these mid-level private sector enterprises in between. So hopefully this was a useful session, and please join us for the dialogue with the on-the-ground experts of the On Global Leadership team. Thank you. Stop.